Hey everybody, I'm going to do an introduction to child development. Some of you may have already taken the child development course at Pierce College, or maybe you took child development in high school. Some of you maybe have yet to take child development as a course, and maybe you aren't going to. So this is just meant to be a brief overview to get the ball rolling. So today we're going to talk about developmental perspective, biological and physical development, brain development, cognitive and intellectual development, social and emotional development, and then we'll talk about the discussion for this week. So here's just a synopsis of child development, or development in general. It's just the pattern of change that begins at conception and continues through the lifespan, right? So we are continuously developing from conception. And when we think of development, we can think of these patterns of development based on a variety of developmentalist perspectives. And so maybe you've heard us talk about Jean Piaget, Erik Erikson, B.F. Skinner, Freud, these other developmental theorists. These folks studied development and really found the different patterns in the different areas of development. So when we talk about cognitive development, we'll talk about Jean Piaget. When we talk about social and emotional development, we might talk about Erik Erikson. When we talk about social development, we might talk about Lev Vygotsky. So these different theorists kind of put their own spin on each area of development by observing the patterns that humans go through over the course of a lifespan. So here are some developmental perspectives. We already know that there's a biological process, and that's the change in an individual's body, right? So when we think about growth and human growth, that's the biological process. And we also have the cognitive process, and that's the changes in our thought, our intelligence, and our language. And so you might notice that an infant, before having the oral motor skills to produce actual words, they could still understand certain words. And then eventually that development comes together with their physical development, and they're able to produce words, right? And then our social and emotional processes. And these are changes in an individual's relationship with other people. They're changes in emotions, and they're changes in personality. And this happens through time with experiences with others. And all of these come together. So the biological processes, the cognitive processes, and the socio-emotional processes, they come together to really help us understand holistic development and what it means to develop as a human. At Pierce College, we think of child development in these four broad developmental domains: physical, intellectual, and cognitive. So sometimes people pair or use the terminology intellectual or cognitive interchangeably. We lump cognitive and intellectual development together. Emotional development and social development. We separate social and emotional development. In some, if you use assessment tools in your early learning programs, or if you've done a lot of reading or research around emotional development, you'll see sometimes social and emotional development get lumped together. At Pierce College, we split those into two distinct developmental domains. Social development really focuses on an individual's relationship to others, and emotional development we define as an individual's relationship to self. And then we have developmental perspective. When we think about, have you heard the argument nature versus nurture? You probably have. I don't really consider it an argument anymore. I consider it nature through nurture, and that our environment does impact our developmental processes. When we think of developmental perspective and these patterns of development that I was mentioning earlier, you could think about them in specific important time periods. There's the prenatal period, which is before birth, and then infancy, early childhood, middle and late childhood, adolescence, and then what is not shown here is adulthood. But we can think of these patterns of development as distinct critical periods. And this is pretty much how we break it down in our field when we talk about these developmental patterns. So let's jump into biological development. So we all know that we have some inherited characteristics, both physical and psychological, that we get from our parents, our moms or dads, our grandmas or grandpas. And these are things that are passed down to us through genetics. And then we also have temperament, and a lot of the research around temperament says that it's innate and it's a part of who we are from birth and on. And then there's some who are on the train of thought that temperament can be flexible and adaptable depending on someone's environment. But temperament is a stable way of reacting and adapting to the world that is present in early life. So you can kind of think of temperament in these 4 areas. So some children or individuals have an easy temperament, some have a difficult temperament, some are slow to warm. So 3, sorry, I think I said 4, I meant 3. So smiling and laughing, regularity in eating and sleeping habits, an approach or withdrawal, adaptability to new situations, intensity of responsiveness, general cheerfulness or unpleasantness, distractibility or persistence or soothability. These are all characteristics of temperament. So now let's start talking about physical development. We already know that there is, for those who are typically developing, there are pretty predictable patterns in growth. We can predict when growth spurts will happen in children. And we can predict, a toddler's head is typically bigger than normal, than average for body in proportion, right? And we just know that's a characteristic of toddler physical development. But the same is true about how our feet grow and how our bodies grow. Through different stages of development, growth happens. And growth we can think about also in our motor development, both our large motor and our small motor. So when you think about motor development, large motor refers to the large muscles in the body, your arms, your legs, your torso. Those are your large muscles. And then small motor, this refers to the small muscles in your arms and hands, as well as the small muscles in your face and your jaw and your tongue and your lips. And so we think of development that way. And if you can remember that children develop from the trunk out, this will help you know just how critically important those large motor skills are in early childhood education. If you want a child to be able to write their name, they need to have had lots of large motor experiences before they get to that small motor experience. And then we have perception, and perception grows and changes along with our eyesight and our hearing acuity. So when you think of visual and auditory acuity, that is impacting our perception. So our depth perception, which impacts our range of motion. And so you could just see how these are all tied together. And then brain development. We could talk a whole 2 hours on brain development, but I'm going to try to just make this as simple and as precise as possible. So when you think of the brain, you can look at the brain as one whole functioning object that works together, but each section has its own job. And most brain development, this is so important, happens within the first 3 years of life. So when we say that the first 1,000 days is important, it really is. And when we think about early learning programs and where we should be focusing state funding and federal funding, it really needs to be in early learning programs because that's when the most brain development is happening. But that's not what we see in our federal programs, right? And then this just means that interactions with caregivers are super, super important for brain development. And different regions of the brain are localized for specific functions. So when you look at the frontal lobe, that's the red section. The frontal lobe it controls motor control, and you could see at the prefrontal cortex there, that little pink dot at the front. is for concentration, planning, and problem solving. Then you could see the other little pink dot is for speech. And then there's one section in the frontal lobe that is responsible for smell. And then the parietal lobe is the yellow section. And you can see that yellow section relates to touch, pressure, and taste, and body awareness. And then the green section is the temporal lobe, and that is responsible for facial recognition and hearing. And then the occipital lobe is the kind of mustardy green, I don't know, I guess kind of light yellow-green, is responsible for vision. And the cerebellum, this is the hindbrain, the bottom part of our brain, and it's responsible for coordination. And so if you just think about how all those parts of the brain work together, the brain, if you think about how the brain develops, not all of these areas have the same critical time frame, right? So our brains develop from the brainstem to that cerebellum and then up. And so it develops from the bottom up, and that frontal lobe is the last part of the brain to fully develop, and it's not fully developed. We don't even know if it ever is fully developed. But some people will say it's not fully developed until an individual is in their mid-20s. And so when you think about laws around smoking, joining the military, driving a car, some of those laws are actually decided and based around brain science. When you can legally have alcohol, when you think about that age, oh, well, I have to be 21 to have alcohol, but I can be 16 to drive a car. Well, think about that. Alcohol inhibits your ability to problem solve, concentrate, and plan, right? So it kind of makes sense that the drinking age is higher than the age to drive a car. And this is just an example of the parts of the brain connections that we see. And so we see dendrites here and synapses, the myelin sheath, the nucleus of a brain cell, the cell body, little dendrites that look like tree branches. These are all parts of our brain cells and how they work together. And this image is one of my favorites. It's such a good visual example of what's happening during brain development. So on the far left is an example of the brain connections. You can see the synapses and the dendrites and the little tree branchy, right, seminoff of a neonate. And then at 6 months, and then at 2 years. And you could see at 2 years, all of those connections are much more thick and dense because that child is taking everything in their whole world in around them and making sense of it, right? And then as the child gets older, once they hit around puberty, or early puberty, around early adolescence, or even in middle childhood, we start pruning some of those things to just make way for the more important connections. And then on your own time, I'll link these videos in the module, but they're also in this presentation. I would like for you to watch these 2 videos on environmental influences on brain development. Let's talk quickly about cognitive and intellectual, and then we'll pause because I'm about to run out of time. Okay, so cognitive and intellectual, this is to focus on how children perceive and mentally represent the world. And this has to do with thinking and learning, problem solving, understanding language, memory development, and building concepts. And so this brain development and this intellectual development is happening from birth, right? And all the experiences that a child has in the world is supporting their cognitive and intellectual development. And when we think about cognitive development, we really think about Jean Piaget, and he really believed that there were cognitive processes that develop in an orderly sequence of stages, and he learned this by observing his own children. He believed that the rate of development is variable to an individual, but the sequence remains consistent. So that just means the sequence of development is the same for everyone, but the rate at which it happens is going to be different based on that individual's experiences with the world. And then he believed that children have schema, we all have schema, and these are the concepts of the world, and that assimilation is incorporating the the new event into existing schemes, and then accommodation. And I'll give an example of this in the next lecture. I'm going to pause here because I'm about to run out of time, and we're going to come back for part 2, and I'll review this slide.